You are listening to a Pleasure podcast. For more from our Sex Podcast Collective, visit pleasurepodcasts.com.
Welcome back to Private Parts Unknown, a podcast about love and sexuality around the world. I'm Courtney Kosak, and privates, today we are getting down to the nuts and bolts of polyamory. No, not those nuts and bolts. The nuts and bolts like finances and cohabitating and child rearing and legal documents. Ugh, how complicated. Well, don't you worry, because our guest Laura Boyle wrote the book on it and she made it easy. Her book is called Monogamy in This Economy. Laura and I had a super interesting conversation, and I think it's relevant regardless of your relationship configuration. So here we go.
Hi, my name is Laura Boyle. I'm the author of Monogamy in This Economy: Finances, Child Rearing, and Other Practical Concerns of Polyamory, which is out now.
So I guess let's start with the Cliff's Notes of your journey as a polyamorous person. I believe you first figured out what it was when you were 19.
Right. So my path through polyamory isn't the one that people normally imagine, which is that like a monogamous couple opens up and then has this like process of transitioning a previously monogamous relationship. I was 19 years old and got asked on a date by like a pretty nice guy at my university who was like, "Have you heard of polyamory?" And I was like, "Poly whatery?" And then he said, "Have you heard of open relationships?" And I, imagining myself to be a very worldly kind of person, was like, "Well, yes, of course I've heard of open relationships." And we went from there. And so over time, I learned more about what I kind of wanted out of a non-monogamous relationship. And I didn't stay in a relationship with that person particularly long. We were only together for about 6 months. But I decided that this sort of paradigm of not being in a closed relationship made sense for me at the time. And over time, I ended up not getting into sort of long-term monogamous relationships again, really, right? Like when I decided to get married, me and my now ex-husband did try out being monogamous for a short period of time, but it didn't really feel right to either of us. And so we went back to non-monogamy pretty quickly. And so like I tend to sort of elide that into my time frame of having been non-monogamous. And so when I'm doing my intro of myself, I go, "Oh, I've been non-monogamous for almost 20 years, right? Because these like short trial periods don't really feel like they count over that long a lifetime."
So that's incredible. First of all, that you were 19 and you could kind of override your social programming and you were like open-minded enough to embrace this philosophy. And also, 20 years ago, the resources weren't really there. Like, how did you figure it out?
I mean, I feel like in some ways 20 years ago, it was significantly harder because you didn't have online resources. You didn't have so many people who you could turn to and get explanations of different options you had. But in some ways, it was kind of easier because I was in a city. I was in kind of a free and open and weird community, right? Mm-hmm. And so the few resources there were, you could go, "Oh, I'm trying to do this open thing." And people could go, "Oh, have you read The Ethical Slut?" And they'd
yes.
just kind of accept from there that you were making your own thing happen, sort of loosely based on some kind of personal code of how things would work. And maybe they personally weren't interested in doing something with you, but they knew somebody who might be.
Yes, yes.
And so you'd kind of move from there, right? And I simultaneously was getting involved with my local kink communities and things like this. And so when you're running in one kind of non-traditional circle, it's easier to find yourself involved with others.
And then how did you become a relationship coach and an educator? And now you've written 2 books from there.
Well, I'm, again, not the poster child of what people expect for these things, although I don't know that there is one for this, right? People come to this through very different paths. I like to joke that I fell into this sideways, and it's kind of true. I did a very kind of traditional life path. I got married, I went to law school, I did all of the like normal things, but I have a lot of chronic health issues, and in 2018 and 2019, some of my chronic health issues were really flaring up, and I ended up having to stop doing my full-time job. And while I was in this period of not being able to do my full-time work and spending a lot of time like marinating and thinking on all of these things, I ended up starting a blog about my polyamorous journey. And lots of folks were resonating with the things that I was putting online. And at the same time, some stuff was coming out online about how Franklin Vo, one of the co-authors of the first edition of More Than Two, was like not such a great guy. And I'd been teaching some classes just for my local community about polyamory because I'd been polyamorous for more than 10 years at this point. And folks at a certain point go, "Oh, you've been doing this pretty successfully for a while. Come teach a class." In the greatest kind of, you do this an okay way, come run a small community thing. And I wanted to put something up where I could point people to a resource list or to a glossary that wasn't the one on his website. Right? And so I made a glossary page, I bought a domain, and I put it up online, and then I started putting my blog at this same domain, and people were really resonating with it. And then the pandemic started, and I was like, oh, well, I guess I'll be like every other white guy in America, and I'll start a podcast.
And white girl.
And so,
just kidding.
Well, right. And I guess we're two female podcasters talking, so I don't have to fully lean into this, like, the dudes do the podcasting kind of stereotype. But at the time, that's sort of what it felt like. It was like bros with microphones talking to each other.
Yeah, totally.
And I was like, well, people really seem to be resonating with this. And people kept writing to me asking for advice. And so I like took a couple of classes so that I didn't feel like I was totally unqualified to be giving advice to people. And then I was like, okay, I'll start offering some support work for people. And eventually this turned into a coaching practice. And since I'd been sick and stopped working, this slowly escalated into what I was actually doing for work.
Amazing. I love that.
So yeah, so a very sideways path into this.
But you have all the life experience, you know, it's like such a perfect fit.
I mean, I don't know about perfect, but it's as good as anybody else's as far as I can tell.
Totally.
Right? And like, I have continued to do some continuing education so that I don't feel like I'm missing out on big chunks of knowledge that I should have, I don't think. And maybe eventually I'll go back and do like a licensure and become somebody's counselor or therapist. But I don't know, that's like a 5-10 year plan.
So monogamy in this economy is such a good book title. What do you cover in the book and what was the inspiration behind it?
So the title is, I mean, as is clear, kind of a joke, right? Like, we see this online all the time, people joking that like they're all going to be polyamorous just to save money, right? And I did this study starting about 2 years ago of asking folks who are living in 3 or more adult households that involve some kind of polyamorous relationship, right? Because some people do just have roommates to save some money, what their lives are like, how it is that they organize their lives, whether that's about where folks sleep or where it is they've chosen to live and why. Some questions about, do they have kids who live with them? How do they organize their finances? All of these things. And I think these sort of everyday questions are things that seem really opaque to monogamous people who want to know about our lives. They're things that I get folks in coaching who feel like they're not going to get to have these very regular everyday experiences of living with their partners, of raising children in a regular family, of all of these things because they've chosen to be polyamorous. And in fact, there are lots of people doing pretty much identical things to monogamous people, maybe with an extra partner along, or maybe with a little bit more discussion about what role their additional partners will play. And so I wanted to get a feeling for whether this like anecdotal sense I had from the people I work with in coaching and from the folks I know in real life was real. I had just under 500 people respond to the survey, and I did follow-up interviews with about 160 folks. And those stories, those people's data and stories, are what made up the bulk of the book.
I love it. I'm also a writer, and just like the way that you went for it with your own study and then blew it out with kind of like the case studies. I just really appreciate the format. I have another podcast about book writing, and I would love to go off on that separately, but
that would be great.
Yeah, very cool. So I have to ask, before we get into the findings in your book a little further, is polyamory growing, or are we just talking about it more?
So it's unclear. Because we didn't start collecting data, or because folks were scared to participate in surveys, because it's still not a protected status, right? There are only 5 cities in the US where there are any sort of protection for polyamorous people. So it's still not a protected status at all. So folks are sort of relying on, do they have other nexuses of privilege? And so you get this like uneven bias usually. And even with that, folks now feel generally sort of a little better protected by the fact that our society is on a slightly more progressive upswing and are more willing to participate in surveys. So we have a slightly better impression of how many people are polyamorous now than we did previously. But even with that, studies from the last 10 years seem to indicate that somewhere between 4 and 6% of North American adults are polyamorous.
That's actually like a significant chunk, I think.
Right, that's about 10 million Americans. And those same studies by the same scientists indicate that about 20% of North American adults try some form of consensual non-monogamy, but aren't currently practicing. That's a huge gap. There's a book by Andrea Zanin that's called Post Non-Monogamy and Beyond, which examines people who for some reason aren't currently non-monogamous. So whether that's folks who have had breakups and now have only one partner, or folks who are widowed and are single currently, or folks who just decided that non-monogamy isn't for them. They tried it and they went, oh, well, that was a really beautiful phase of our lives, but like, I'm not doing that anymore. And so that 15%, that additional like 30 million Americans tried non-monogamy at some point and don't want to do it anymore, or might do it again in the future, but aren't right now.
I mean, it's probably even more, if you count like people that are just dating multiple people, dating around, it's really like most people.
Well, look, I don't want to put identity language on anyone who doesn't want to have it.
Yeah. Fair enough. But I'm just saying, I have sort of participated as well, like.
Well, right. And if you look at, I was on another podcast where I was talking about polyamorous parenting, and people love to try to, as a gotcha, go like, but what if someone has an unexpected pregnancy? And whenever they do that, I bring out the story of my own pregnancy, which was an unexpected pregnancy.
Yeah.
And I do the whole story because it ends happily, because this is great, because my 10-year-old is beautiful and is raised by 3 parents who love him very much. But it was, at the time, not an expected event. And it had some steps in our relationship that involved like some questions and some going, okay, but who's the father? Let's do a blood test. But like you walk through all the steps and it's the plot of an episode of Friends. It's Rachel going, who's the father of this baby? And so when you consider it, none of these problems are uniquely polyamorous problems. You just view them through a slightly different lens because we encompass a slightly different worldview. There are all sorts of situations in which people have to have virtually identical conversations, right? A lot of the parallels I draw in the book are things like step parenting, or things like, okay, you're going to figure out conversations you should have before you decide whether or not you're going to divide finances with people and things like this. These are conversations I hope monogamous people are having as well. But I know that culturally, we're generally told not to, which is why like finances are the number one cause of divorce.
Let's talk about some of your biggest findings. So finances, child rearing, cohabitation, these were three of your big topics. What did you discover?
So, as much as polyamorous influencers love to go on TikTok and make videos where we go, we're not all thruples who nest. Of the people who are living together in groups of more than two, 3 is the most common household size by a long shot. And of the folks I spoke to, the most commonly expressed reason for this is just it's easier to solve problems when you're only getting 3 people to agree than if you're getting 4 or more people to agree to something. And that sounds self-evident, but it was deeply shocking to me as one of these people who has a million times made the video like, we don't all live in thruples, I promise. We don't. And in fact, many more polyamorous people live in dyads in groups of 2 and just date outside the home than live in any of the households that I'm talking about in this study and in this book. But once you get into those larger household sizes, 3 is the most common number.
How are people dealing with kids? And I know it's so diverse, and you go through all the steps in the book or all the scenarios, but what's common as far as finances and child rearing? How do people split that up?
So all sorts of things are possible, just like with step parenting, where you're very much coming up with it as you go. And there is not a strict, I can tell you the best practices of how to be a step parent to these children. With polyamorous parenting, I can't tell you the best practices of how to become a parent to children that your partners already have.
Mm-hmm.
However, common issues that people experience are choosing not to move in additional parents or having partners become in a parenting role when they're splitting custody with another partner or parent who is not polyamorous. Right? Because the most common custody battle or struggle that people experience is when one person who is a parent of a child is not polyamorous and disapproves of the other parent's polyamory. Secondarily, there are many, many jurisdictions in the United States where you can get what's called a co-parenting agreement written up. That is a much lower bar than being like legally the parent of that child. It doesn't count as like a third parent adoption, but it's all of you agreeing on paper to the obligations that you intend to fulfill to one another and to that child, so that for a duration, you agree what your obligations and rights are. And if there's a breakup, it puts on paper what you intend to do for one another in terms of access to the child. And so, especially in the 38 states that recognize multiple parents, it's generally suggested that you talk to a local lawyer and see what you can put on paper.
I mean, there's deliberate family planning choices versus accidents. And
Right.
I think you're suggesting that maybe making some like conscious decisions is maybe a better way to go. What's your philosophy on this?
I mean, look, I think as all of our mothers and fathers would probably tell us, we can make beloved accidents work at any time of our lives, but whenever possible, planning forward is helpful. And so moving forward with intention and planning is always great. If you're able to plan forward, tons of people spoke to me about a million different schemes for forward planning, whether that's for having additional children after you've already moved in together, or whether that's for adding adults to a household with children. And I outline a bunch of those different ways of planning in the book. So whether that's deciding who are going to be the biological parents of a new child, because people made all kinds of different choices about that, whether that's making sure that the parents are people who are already legally married, or whether that's saying, oh, someone who isn't in our legally married couple is going to be a biological parent. Let's make sure we get paternity tests done and put all of that in writing carefully, right? All of these choices are feasible and possible, but think about them in advance, get what needs to be in writing appropriately. And yeah, all of this is stuff that talking to a family lawyer in your area is necessary and appropriate. And throughout the book, in the finance chapter, I sort of open it with, I am not a financial professional. Please speak to your local financial planner, right? Get your CPA involved if you can. Especially if you, unlike me, have serious assets, as opposed to like we're figuring out how to split the monthly bills.
Yes, totally. I mean, okay, so back to the polyamory question of like, is it becoming more prevalent? Or it seems like for what is undeniable is that we're talking about it more. And so I'm curious if the stigma has evolved, hopefully dissipated over your polyamorous journey. Are you noticing differences with that?
It's something that's easier to talk about in public, which is great. It's also something that we're at that sort of crest of the wave of you can talk about it in public, but people can also insult you about it in public in a way that they couldn't previously.
Yeah.
That said, just because people can be mean about it online, people are generally pretty well behaved when they're looking at you in the face. So I always tell clients this in coaching, no matter how mean people seem to be, like online, on the internet, saying awful things in general, most people will not be like that in person. When they can look you in the face, they are much less likely to say horrible, rude things, with the possible exception of your immediate family, your best friends or former best friends. Those are the people you're going to have very difficult conversations with when you first come out if they don't understand what's going on with you.
Let's talk about shifts in sexuality and the dynamics of jealousy and envy. Any surprises there?
I was really pleasantly surprised at how many people were like, oh, we totally over prepared while getting ready to move in. We were totally convinced that it was going to be so hard when moving in together to like hear our partners living intimately with other people, that overhearing sexuality was going to be really difficult. And so I psyched myself up to death about how much I was going to be hearing, seeing, whatever about them and the other people we were nesting with. And that was not a problem at all. But they were likewise surprised by how much additional jealousy there was when anyone in that unit who they were used to, who they'd built up this store of like tips and tricks for dealing with, then got additional partners outside the home who came over occasionally or who they went out to see sometimes. That was the new, like, this feels new, this feels scary, this has jealousy wrapped up in a way that the folks who they're prepared for don't. And this is really true for couples who are just opening up as well. Like, you get used to a certain cadence. When you start seeing someone and they have an established partner, those established partners feel okay. But then you've been together for 6 months or a year, and each of you starts dating someone new, and those new people feel scary. And it's that same phenomenon writ a little larger because now you live together. And so it wasn't precisely surprising, but it was a little surprising how consistent it was. How many people in the survey brought that up as a reality.
I'm curious how it manifests for you, some of this stuff in the book.
Well, I talk a lot about my previous household where I lived with my ex and ex-meta, because I don't currently live with any partners. I live with my parents and my kids, and I have 2 partners, but neither of them lives with me. So for me personally, some of these things mattered when we all lived together and matter significantly less now. Like the co-parenting stuff still impacts because we co-parent.
Mm-hmm.
And it matters in that, like, I have regular check-ins with my partner of 9 years about whether we're comfortable with how entangled with each other's kids we are and things like this. Everyone has concerns about jealousy, and everyone has concerns about whether you might want to live together someday. But for the most part, for me, what this has all taught me is I'd prefer not to move in with anyone until my kids are adults at this point.
Uh-huh.
And then I'll figure out whom I want to live with then. when I can worry about a smaller space.
Yes.
But like, I feel like that's an in this economy concern just because of the cost of housing.
Yeah. Yeah, that's totally relevant. Well, I guess I'm curious what advice you would give to other polyamorous parents who, obviously get the book, but are thinking about inviting other people into the household, things like that. Any kind of like top line advice?
I mean, in general, my advice to polyamorous parents is move a little bit slowly in the sort of entanglement phases with someone and talk about what disentanglement will look like. So, as you're spending time with someone more and they're spending more and more time with your kids, be ready for what happens if you have a breakup with them. If they're really close with your kids and they're the person who like is helping them learn some new skill or whatever, that's beautiful. That's a wonderful relationship that they have. But be ready if that means that you're going to have to facilitate that relationship for them after a breakup.
Mm-hmm.
Or be prepared that, like, maybe you won't be in a place where you want to do that, but your other partner will be able to do that for them. Think about what that sort of might feel like. I think also, if you're looking at houses or housing, think about how much personal space you guys really need and whether that's something you can afford to have.
Mm-hmm.
Because, like, in the wild sort of cost of living we currently live in, often, especially if there are kids involved, we'll make sure that kids have personal space ahead of the adults having personal space.
Mm-hmm.
And if you're doing that, at least make sure that there are like doors to close between you if people are in conflict, because having that level of personal space can make it a lot easier to manage conflicts.
So everyone can take something away from this, but you're actually a relationship anarchist as well. So I would love to hear, I know a little bit about that, but if you could kind of explain what that is and how that kind of framework can help all of us in our relationships.
Sure. So the elevator pitch for relationship anarchy, just so that it'll demystify it a little. Relationship anarchy is the idea that all of your relationships, your romantic relationships, your familial relationships, your friendships, all exist on the same plane. Romance isn't on some mystical plane where it's more important and you have to treat your romances as the most important thing in your life, and then your family, and then your friends. No, they're all equally important. And it's about who has a need at the moment that you're prioritizing, or what your needs are that are being met in these relationships at the moment. It's not that, like, my partner of 9 years is the most important and my partner of 2 years is the next most important, and then my mom and my kids, and then everybody else, right? No, all of them. And it's who has a need today and who has a need tomorrow. And everybody sort of chips in as they can and so on, right? It's a little bit more communal in exactly the way that folks don't expect when they hear the word anarchy. And people define for themselves what each individual relationship contains and means. So it doesn't necessarily follow that because a relationship has a label that it necessarily fits all of the like tick boxes of the cultural definition of that label. So somebody being your boyfriend doesn't mean necessarily that you have sex with them, right? You could not have that part of your relationship. Somebody could be asexual, whatever. But it could include all the other parts of it. It could include commitment. It could include date nights. It could include like emotional intimacy, a bunch of other components. This is often represented through what's called the relationship smorgasbord, which is a big graphic that includes all the different things you might want to do with somebody, which includes things like being business partners and raising children and like a bunch of other things that you don't always think of as being in a relationship,
Uh-huh.
but you pick and choose things off of that to put on your relationship plate with somebody.
Uh-huh.
Off of this buffet of options. And the idea is that you build a unique relationship with each person who you meet and want to relate to, and that you do this even with family members who you interact with regularly, even with friends who you spend a lot of time with, and that the difference between friendship and relationship can kind of blur if you're close.
Yeah, and really, I feel like it illustrates the value of just, even if you're doing what looks like monogamy, it's just like deciding which parts you like actually want to participate in can be really valuable.
Right. You can be a relationship anarchist and be sexually monogamous and be, I think it's hard to be emotionally monogamous and be a relationship anarchist, because what does emotional monogamy mean in that context?
Right.
But you could be romantically monogamous. It's just about how you define romance, right? It could mean that, like, you don't buy roses for somebody, or you don't go on what you think of as a date, but you still see your friends regularly and you're emotionally intimate with all the people you're emotionally intimate with. And so, like, it's about chosen family, and it's about building the life that you want with these people. And I feel like at its heart, that's what building a non-traditional family is about.
Thank you so much to Laura Boyle, and definitely make sure you pick up a copy of Monogamy in This Economy. And thank you so much for tuning into this episode of Private Parts Unknown. Stay tuned right here, because I've got another sexy episode coming your way next week. And for the latest episodes, look down and make sure you're following the show on your favorite podcast player now. It's like a follow or a subscribe button usually, or on Spotify, it's also like a bell button. To stay in touch between episodes, follow me at Courtney Kosak. My last name is Kosak on Instagram and Twitter. And follow the show at Private Parts Unknown on Instagram and at Private Parts Un on Twitter. And hey, privates, I am shamelessly trying to hit the top 1% on OnlyFans always and forever. So if you are interested in a Playboy-style peek behind the podcast, you can subscribe to my OnlyFans account. It is onlyfans.com/CocoPeepShow. It is a very horny way to help support the show. So if you are interested, head on over to onlyfans.com/CocoPeepShow. And of course, subscribe to our newsletter over at privatepartsunknown.substack.com. There is a link for that in the episode description. And subscribe to the Private Parts Unknown YouTube channel for the video version of a bunch of episodes. The audio episodes also automatically update over there. So head on over to youtube.com/privatepartsunknown and smash that subscribe button. That is youtube.com/privatepartsunknown. And check out my other podcasts for more of my audio creations. I have The Bleeders, about book writing and publishing, and Podcast Bestie, which is a best friend to podcasters trying to grow and monetize their shows. If you are a writer and you not only want to generate a ton of new material, but get it published, like the viral essay for Cosmo that I read several episodes back, I have got the writing intensive of your dreams going down in November. Yes, baby, I am bringing it back for November. Pitch Party is coming back for November. It's actually the November newsletter and pitch party extravaganza. We are going to have fun. We are going to amp up our newsletters. We are going to pitch stuff. We are going to just generate a ton of words. So if you are interested, head on over to my website. It is CourtneyKosak.com/teaching. Again, last name is Kosak. So it's CourtneyKosak.com/teaching. And you can use code PRIVATE for $100 off. Shout out to Amy Rausch for the bomb-ass theme music. For more info about Amy and her music, check out amyrausch.com. That is Amy, RAASCH.com. This episode was mixed by my beloved audio guy, Michael Castaneda of Plastic Audio. And after enjoying this content, could we ask you for a quick favor? We really need some new ratings and reviews. So you can do that no matter where you're listening. Just head on over to ratethispodcast.com/private and give us a 5-star rating and review. Or you can rate and review us in the app of wherever you're listening right now, and we will so appreciate it. So again, You can rate and review the show from anywhere by going to ratethispodcast.com/private, and it would mean a lot to get some fresh ratings and reviews. And there is one last way you can help support the show. We are now on the Fountain app, so if you are listening on a V4V platform and you get value from this show, you can support us by sending a boostagram. You can even send a comment along with your boost, and I have to say, those are my favorite messages to get because they come with a little bit of Bitcoin. Thank you so much for sticking with me until the end. Until next time, stay curious and keep exploring. Love you, privates.